Hello and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, hi, I'm Cassie. If it's not, thanks for always tuning into my videos. If you have been following my channel, you probably know that I am hosting a readathon in April called Realmathon. And in Realmathon, you can get bonus points for reading a military fantasy because it is one of my favorite subgenres. So I figured we would do a Realmathon military fantasy recommendation video. And also, if you haven't yet checked out the announcement video for Realmathon, it will be linked in the description bar below. I think it's pretty cool. Not to toot my own horn, I think I did a pretty cool job creating this immersive readathon. And I'm just so excited for April to come. Getting into the recommendation part of the video, I guess we should kind of talk about what a military fantasy is. To me, a military fantasy is a book that tends to focus on the war and the militia effort of the book. There tends to be a lot of battles and things like that, but I know a lot of people just count if there's like battles in it and like rebellions and stuff like that. Like a lot of political fantasies do lean towards a military fantasy. And with my readathon, I pretty much made the only rule: if you think a book counts, please count it. If you don't think a book counts, please don't count it. So in this list, I will go over like some of the ones that I think truly count, and then I have a couple stretches. Because with the readathon, there are the subgenre categories for each realm, and I wanted to make sure that each realm had at least one or two military fantasies that they could read that were also part of their subgenre to get them all those bonus points. So there are a couple stretches in here, I can't lie, but I love stretching a prompt, and feel free to stretch my prompts in my readathon. Let's start by doing each category, and then I'll just do a couple like broader military fantasies that don't necessarily fit into any of these subgenres. The easiest subgenre to do with a military fantasy is Grimdark, which is the subgenre for the realm of Calamus, where we have the mother demon and the mother demon children, which are fire-spitting cat-like demons that bond to you, the Calidra. Here are some military recs that I myself would consider Grimdark, but as I said, Grimdark again is really expansive and not necessarily what I consider Grimdark. I know everyone else considers Grimdark. It's a very broad category in itself. First off, we have the Poppy War, which is my favorite trilogy. All three of them are a favorite of mine. They follow Rin as she gets accepted into a academy, and she's kind of, because of her skin color and where she grew up, she wasn't supposed to have made it to this academy, and she made it, and then she's kind of like learning the magic and the gods, and she goes out to military. The first half of this book is a military school, with the second half being more focused on military, and then the books 2 and 3 focus on the military themselves. This is also based on our real life wars, really gruesome things that we did as humans, and I really loved this book. It's a little bit of a polarizing book. I feel like you either love it or hate it, but I hope everyone reads it, and it's definitely a military fantasy, and I love it. The bonus points for it being military fantasy and a grimdark fantasy, but it also counts towards a Casty fave. Literally on the cover they said they trained her for a war, she intends to end it. Military. It's incredible, amazing. I gave the whole series 5 stars. Chef's kiss. Incredible. Another grimdark one is the Rage of Dragons, which this is the second book that I'm holding up, which is the Fires of Vengeance, which I actually haven't read yet, and I might have to read in April. But the first one is we're following our main character Tao, who his life is really hard, and something that happens sets him out on a quest for revenge and a quest to prove himself as the best, that he can do things that the people above him can do as well. And the magic system of this is really cool, but we follow Tao as he joins the military and tries to become like the best officer, the best general, and it's just such a dark, gruesome story. With both of these, the Poppy War and Rage of Dragons, we're following protagonists who we don't necessarily love. We don't love the decisions they're making. They're gritty, they're dark, it just feels, I just get the feels from them because I feel like they feel really human to me in that way. Even though they're really dark, I can understand why they got dark, and I love Grimdark for that reason. I always can understand how this would happen to someone. And yeah, I don't know. I loved this book. The magic system itself follows a world, I can never remember this, where it's about 1 in every 1,000 of men have the power to like get stronger, and 1 in every 10,000 women have the power to call on the dragons. And the aspect of the dragons in this is so cool. I loved the way the dragon worked, and there's like a shadow realm that's also really cool. And again, I gave the first book, Rage of Dragons, 4 stars. Haven't read this one, but another Casty fave for the Grimdark category and a military fantasy. This one kind of fits 2 categories in my opinion. I think Red Sister by Mark Lawrence, which is the first book in the book The Ancestor trilogy, could fit both Grimdark and polar fantasy. I know polar fantasy could be a bit of a stretch to people, but the reason for the war is literally that the ice is consuming everything and there's less land. I feel like it fits polar fantasy, but I know some people that wouldn't be considered a polar fantasy. To me, a polar fantasy just like has to revolve around the world. Like the ice is like a big part, the climate, the snowy, cold climate is a big part of the story, and I find that it is. With Red Sister, the first book in this is not as big of a military aspect as much as Grey Sister and Holy Sister, but I will be counting in this readathon. If the whole series as a whole focuses on the military aspects, you can count the beginning books. I know in lots of fantasies, the first books are more set up and you don't necessarily get to see that like grittiness yet. And so Red Sister follows Nona Grey, who goes to the Covenant of Nuns, but they are assassin nuns, and you are watching her grow up throughout this series, and there is a prophecy for a chosen one, and she could be the chosen one. And there's a lot of cool magic in here. I really enjoyed the magic, and it is a school setting kind of within the Covenant, and they're doing like Red Sister, Grey Sister, and Holy Sister all like different years in the Covenant, and I really enjoyed that aspect too. But then there is a war and they are training to be nuns for this war, so I think it counts as a military aspect. I think the war has a huge part of it, and they are soldiers in the war. They're just a different type of soldier because they have a bit of a magical ability. And yeah, another Casty fave. I gave the whole series, I think I gave Red Sister 4, Grey Sister 5, and Holy Sister 4, so they all count as Casty faves too, and again for both polar fantasy and Grimdark fantasy. And then one I haven't read that I think is a military fantasy is also by the same author of Red Sister. Mark Lawrence also wrote Prince of Thorns, which is a Broken Empire trilogy. This is on my must-read list. I actually have a special edition coming from the Broken Binding, and I don't really know what this one's about. I know it's Grimdark. Mark Lawrence writes a lot of Grimdark, and I'm guessing I think from what I've heard, it's a military aspect. I haven't read this one, so I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is. And another one that is a little bit borderline Grimdark, I myself don't know if I would count it as Grimdark, but I know a lot of people do, and I think it's mainly because of the author, is Half a King by Joe Abercrombie. This book, we are following Prince Yarvi, who has vowed that he will never be king, but when something happens to his brother and his father, he is kind of forced to take the throne. But things are going on, and it's more of like a revenge story to get the crown, and there is a lot of battles and wars without. This one to me this one isn't as big of a military aspect, like a focus on the militia as the other ones. Like this one's a bit of a stretch, but I did want to put it in here as it is an option. And there is a decent amount of war happening between the countries in here that matter to the plot, but this book is not as dark as I was hoping. Obviously, with the author being Joe Abercrombie, he's like the daddy of Grimdark. I haven't read the First Law trilogy. I picked this one up before to like get a taste of his writing, but this is definitely not that dark in my opinion, so I think it's like borderline. I'm gonna put it in here, but I myself don't know if I'd actually count it as Grimdark, but for the readathon, you do you. And with this one, there is 50 pages of a polar setting. So again, you could stretch it to being a polar fantasy too, if you would like. And I gave this one 4 stars. So another one you could read for a Casty fave. And another Grimdark is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a story about a girl who finds out that she has a destiny for nothing, but her brother is destined for greatness, and when her brother dies, she takes over his destiny and is going to become greatness. And this book, I recently read it and I gave it 4 stars, and I really, really enjoyed it. This is full-on military militia, and it's really good. We're following Ju Jongba and a couple other characters, my favorite being Oyang, and Oyang is where I think the darkness really gets ya, and I love Oyang. And I don't really have much to say about this one. I definitely would recommend reading this one. It was a really quick read. It's short for a Grimdark too. It's only about 400 pages. And it's really good. There is a fisting scene though, so watch out for that. let's move into polar fantasy, as there are a couple. As we already talked about, we have Red Sister and we have Half a King that I think you could stretch to be polar fantasies. This one's more of a stretch. I think this one counts. But I do have a couple more. We have Winter of Ice and Iron by Rachel Numier. This book I haven't actually read. I've read, I think, about 40 pages, and then I put it down because I was slumping, and I know I'm going to really love this book, so I wanted to give it a fair chance, not when I was slumping. And from the 40 pages I read, I do know that it will be a military fantasy. It might lean more heavily on the politics, but there is a major war happening in here, and that will be a main front. This one sounds so good, so I definitely am going to try and push it on to people. I plan on reading it, I think, in April. I'm not committing myself to anything until I see what TBR, Snakes and Ladders, Snakes and TBR Stacks does to me, but I am hoping to probably get to this one. This follows... I'm not going to tell you about this because I just read the back and it spoils a lot, I think, so I don't need you to know. I believe we are following a land where the power is kind of attached to figures and family bloodlines, and you can get people to submit their power to you and like extract their power. And we have the Mad King who is trying to go across the world and get everyone's powers, and we have the daughter of another king who is going to save them all. I think. And it's cold and it's brutal, and what I read sounded really good, so I'm very excited. As I said, I'm doing a little bit of stretching because I wanted there to be things for every category. So, we have The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. I have read book 1 and 2 of these. They're not my favorite, like, they're not a book for me. I didn't enjoy them. But I do know that book 2 starts to focus more on the war, and someone had told me that they think that book 3 does a little bit more than that. So, since the trilogy as a whole kind of focuses on the war, I will be counting all 3 of them as a military fantasy. But again, it's up to the individual. If you don't think it counts, don't count it, but if you do think it counts, count it. The Bear and the Nightingale is inspired by like Russian folklore and the Baba Yaga, and follows our main character Vasya as she kind of just fights against the old religion and the new religion. There is a lot of impacts of what happened with Christianity in this book, and it is a very atmospheric read. Lots of people love it, and I'm just gonna say that it counts, and it's polar. This one also will count for a whimsical fantasy because I think it is very whimsical, so you will see it in the list for those. Another one is The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid. I recently read this. Again, I only gave it 2 stars, but I don't like atmospheric reads, guys. This is a thing. Don't like them. This one is a real stretch because you don't really see the war in it, but the war and the military has a huge impact on the story. So I'll let the stretch happen because again, I really wanted something for every category, and both of these are literally the only 2 books I have for whimsical fantasy as well. Oh, that's not true. I have one other for whimsical fantasy. So I needed something, so I'm letting these stretch. And again, these will count for whimsical fantasy as well. The Wolf and the Woodsman is a Little Red Riding Hood retelling is what I was sold, but it's like inspired by. I think retelling now has become such a loose term. They obviously using the idea of the wolf and the woodsman vibe for the Little Red Riding Hood part, but we are following a girl who is a wolf girl. She has powers of the old world. The king asks for a sacrifice from this village of wolf girls every couple years, and so she has been chosen to go for a sacrifice, but when something happens on her way back to the kingdom, it's only her and one woodsman left standing, and things kind of heat up. It's also a fantasy romance, so it will count for fantasy romance as well. This one counts for a lot here. With that, those are my last couple polar fantasies that I have. So we are going again into whimsical fantasy, which we have these 2 that will count. But we also have one more. I did find another one. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. There is a this is a stretch because I think the movies focus more on the military aspect than the book does. But the whole Lord of the Rings series is kind of based on a war, and so we're gonna stretch it again. And The Hobbit, the writing is kind of whimsical, the world is kind of whimsical. Like, whimsical fantasy to me is like lyrical and like magic and a lot of other things, so I am stretching this one. I'm not gonna tell you what The Hobbit is about because I feel like everyone knows what the Lord of the Rings is about, and I'm just gonna waste time that these are my 3 whimsical fantasy, military fantasy recommendations. They're all a bit of a stretch, but it's my own readathon, so I can do whatever I want, right? And tell you to do whatever you want. And the last is fantasy romance, and there's actually quite a bit of fantasy romance that I think has a military aspect. So we have things like ACOTAR, which is the first book doesn't really, but the second and third books do have more of a military theme. But this one, again, is a bit of a stretch. But I think more like From Blood and Ash, the next couple books would count as a military fantasy book. And the Plated Prisoner series, the first book, Guild, I think I've read, and I think it definitely counts as a military fantasy. I'm not describing what any of these are about because I feel like they're so well known, but Guild is a King Midas retelling. It follows our main character who is gold-touched. She is kind of the king's trophy, and we're just kind of following her journey through there. And obviously there's a romance that happens at some point. The other one that I think is a major military fantasy is actually The Bridge Kingdom. The Bridge Kingdom I really enjoyed. I gave the first 2 3 stars and the most recent 4 stars. And I would just count this one. The Bridge Kingdom follows... I honestly don't really want to tell you what The Bridge Kingdom is about because I feel like it's a bit of a spoiler, so I'm not going to tell you. But all 4 of these that I've read would count towards a military fantasy, in my opinion. And then the other one that I have that I don't know if I would necessarily call it fantasy romance, but it is a romance-based fantasy, is An Ember in the Ashes by Sava Tahir. This has a decent amount of a romance plot in it, so I feel like you can count it. And it is literally based on the militia. This is like a full-on military fantasy. There's no stretching involved here. I haven't read this one in a long time. I think I gave the whole series around 4 stars. I did actually really enjoy this. It is a YA series. You're going to get typical YA tropes, but that was exactly what I wanted when I read it. So just be like warned picking that up, that's what you're going to get. We are following 2 characters, Laia and Elias. Elias is a mask, which is like the soldiers for the kingdom and the empire, and Laia's brother is arrested for treason, and she ends up joining the resistance in order to get him back. And then the resistance kind of forces her into the military camp, and things start to happen and unravel. And I actually really did enjoy this, and the world is the Middle Eastern lore of like jinn and efrits and all of that, which is something I really, really love. I always say if you loved the magic system in Daevabad, this has similar magic systems. So I would count that one. And I think that's all I have for the exact subgenres, but I do have a couple extra military fantasies that I'm going to share with you. We have one that I love and gave 4 stars, which is Legacy of Ash. Oh god, I always struggle to tell people what this one is about. This follows 3 main characters, 2 of which are prisoners of war because their mother was the leader of the rebellion, and you're following them as their mother's killer comes to them and asks for help to save their little area of the world against the invading country. And this is just full of politics, and there is literally 200 pages of battle scenes, and I really, really enjoyed this one. I do always have to say to people though, it's a long, chunky book. The first 100 or so pages I feel like are really good, and then we do get a good amount of slumping happening, but if you can push past that slump, like I almost put it down, but if you can push past it, it's so incredible. And I think that there's a reason for the slump, and upon a reread, I think that this book would not slump at all, because you're learning and building so much up during those like slumpy chapters that you don't realize are really going to be beneficial for the next 50% of the book. I definitely do love this one, and I really need to get to Legacy of Steel and Legacy of Light sometime this year, but it's just so chunky, it's intimidating, but I will push this on people. Like, I know it's chunky, but it's so good. And then another chunk is The Way of Kings, the Stormlight Archive. I've only read the first book in The Way of King. I did give it 5 stars back when I read it, but I have zero idea what happened anymore. I'm probably gonna have to reread this one before I continue the series. because I literally have no idea what happened. I just know that this is on a lot of military fantasy lists. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I'm putting this on here because I've seen it on so many military fantasy lists. So you can count it as a military fantasy. And it's Sanderson, so you'll probably love it. We also have Malice, which I've only read the first book in this series. I have the rest. I need to continue. And I believe that the military aspect becomes a bigger thing as the series goes on, especially with the prophecy that we have gotten in this book. But this first book, it's very minor in it. But again, because the series as a whole focuses on the militia, I will take it. I will let you. So I gave this one 5 stars, and it's one of my favorite books. I need to continue. I love this series. Well, I love this book. I love John Quinn's writing. And yeah, you should read it. I'll push it on everyone. It's amazing. This follows a prophecy of the brightest sun and the darkest star, I think, is what it is correctly. And you're following characters just trying to figure out who is that brightest star and who is that darkest sun. And it's just so good, and there's an animal companion. Amazing. And the last one is actually a book that I hope to get to in April as well, which is His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik, which is book 1 of the Temeraire series. I believe this is a major military fantasy. Valiant warriors rise to Britain's defense by taking to the skies, not aboard aircraft but atop the mighty backs of fighting dragons. Feels militia to me. And there's dragons in this, and it's really short, so I feel like it'll be a good read for the readathon, and it's military fantasy, and there's dragons, so what else can go better than this? Like, nothing can go wrong, right? Right? I don't really know more than that. Can't lie to you. So there we go. Those are all of my military fantasy recs for Realmathon. I will repeat again that the rules for the readathon is if you think a book counts, please count it. If you don't think a book counts, please don't count it. I'm being really lax with the rules. I'm not policing anything. I'm not going to go through the spreadsheet and delete things that I think are wrong. So as you can probably tell, a lot of these are stretches, and feel free to stretch things yourself. I'm just so excited for it. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video and you'd like to leave me an emoji to let me know that you were here, leave me a mountain emoji. If you would like to connect with me on other platforms, my Bookstagram, my Book Twitter, my Goodreads, and my beauty channel, and the Realmathon announcement and Realmathon Discord will all be in the description bar below. Have yourselves a wonderful day, guys. Take care.